This is Katrin with Disability Rights New York. Welcome to our podcast, Empire State of Rights Closed Captioned. We are here to bring you information on the most relevant topics regarding disability rights and advocacy. Today we have Seamus Cunningham, staff analyst here at DRNY. He's here to discuss the educational limitations placed upon people with disabilities and how these barriers affect later employment. Seamus, thanks for joining us today. How you doing?
Thank you, Katrin. It's a pleasure to be here.
So this is a large topic, and we probably won't get to all of the questions that people in our audience may have about it. But let's start by asking you to explain what the educational limitations placed upon people with disabilities are. What is the core of these issues?
Well, I think it comes down to two factors. The first one being the least restrictive environment, or as it's abbreviated, LRE. And basically what happens is for students to gain the academic support they need, they're usually placed within the setting that matches any limitation they may have, whether it be a disability or an academic performance. However, though it's not bad all the time, the only downside is that it may not provide as much access to the community outside of the school and also in-school functions as usually would be done with a general education setting, such as a general classroom. For example, there may be a field trip, and because the content may be a little advanced, the schools may not think of including the self-contained classroom, which is usually the LREs in the public schools. They may not be invited to come along at first because they feel that the content is above the general population in that room. However, you may have 2 or 3 students who are very interested in the topic and could actually learn. So it sort of decreases that access to community learning. However, sometimes it is needed for the students' needs. And not all the time are they forgotten about, but in some cases that's a risk. And the second really comes down to the socioeconomic status of the district itself, which is hard for schools to control because that's something that happens externally. You may have students that are referred for special services simply because they don't have the finances to get extra help on the side or tutoring programs. And also schools may have to cut these extracurricular events such as tutoring or peer groups because there's just not enough money to provide that. And that could lead to them having lower academic performance, which then could lead them to being referred for special services.
So all of these factors are really based on several other factors is what I'm hearing. So depending on the school district, where it is, depending on the student itself, depending on the classroom or the group that those students are placed in. So when it comes down to these individual decisions, are there more people that help make these decisions? Is it school administrators, the teachers, the parents? Do the students themselves, do they have an opportunity to weigh in on whether or not they're included in a community event?
That's a good question. It really is a complex environment in the field of education because first and foremost, a lot of the education policy and law comes from the states, and then it gets passed down to the cities and counties, and then it comes to the administration. So it's a long trail from the top to the actual school itself. And in the end, it could, for budgeting, usually it's the district itself and their board that makes decisions. It could be different for other schools. And then the administrator usually would make changes that directly may impact the students based on their school board that they answer to. Students, usually there sometimes is an opportunity, especially in the secondary ages, high school. However, it comes to the risk of the LRE having that connotation that they can't as much speak for themselves. And I think that's where we get to the risk of not fully addressing their needs, but also desires. Every student, I feel, has a goal, and they need to be shown that they're listened to in order to feel that it's possible. And when you have the stereotypical thought that in these classrooms, they really have to be totally dependent, that's not always true. They could have independence that they could speak for themselves. So it's always a risk there, and that we need to acknowledge that they could speak for themselves at times.
So again, a very large topic for us to be tackling today. So talk to us a little bit about why do least restrictive environments, or LREs, why do they fail to meet the ultimate goal of student inclusion?
Well, I think though not bad all the time, for students who have the ability to, even for a few classes of the day, be in a general ed setting, it really does a disadvantage because a lot of times when you look at school funding, many of the resources go to the general education classrooms, not the self-contained classrooms. And if you wanted services in the LRE, a lot of times you have to go through the district for support services, such as whether it be a Dynavox or a specialized laptop for a student if they can't do handwritten assignments on their own. It becomes more difficult to get the resources. And again, it's not a one size fits all. It depends on the district, on the policies of the district. But the issue comes that there's not enough, as much resources that are put in. And when you look at school funding, when cuts happen at times, and from my experience in the field of education, it seems that cuts will be made to the self-contained classrooms before the general ed classrooms, and even to the extent where some districts go to just one or two self-contained classrooms in the actual district for each range of grades. Like 1 through 3 will have one self-contained classroom in this elementary school. 4 through 6 may have one in this elementary school. So it really, the risk of budget cuts really hits self-contained classrooms, which is the LREs. And then if you have out-of-district schools, such as a residential treatment center school, there's not as much oversight. So the academic topics that are shaped to prepare them for the future are not always adhered to. And though it's good to have flexibility for each student need, there also has to be that unison in what's covered and the skills that are taught to them that aren't as overseen as in a district school. And also, not to mention the behavior intervention services. There's this positive behavior in public schools. That's the main thing now. It may not be the case in a private school or a charter school or a out-of-district school.
So for students who are not provided the proper educational setting and as a result are labeled as incapable of being productive, how does that system typically handle the situation?
I think that there is a rush to judgment when it comes to this. Many people have the idea that students in common are lazy or hopeless. And especially if you look in the inner city schools or the residential treatment centers for outside of the districts. For example, 2 of them in this area where I went to work in college, the stereotypical thought in the community was, oh, the bad boy school or the bad girl school. And these students hear that, they realize this, and the staff realizes this. And it all goes up to the policymakers. So when they create the budget, they're probably going to give more funds to schools that are succeeding, and put that in quotes, versus ones that are struggling to succeed, which is because that these students face a lot of limitations. And also that education is not an 8 to 3 job. It is not a 9 to 5 job. And that a lot of times teachers try to fit everything in the limited time they have. And with limited resources and the economy the way it is, at times it's very difficult to meet the needs even of students. I mean, you may have a classroom self-contained with only 6 students, but they all require different needs. And it really, the only feedback that teachers receive or students receive, if it is only a failing mark or a poor evaluation, what will happen if to their outlook? The students will become less productive because they don't see, well, why am I here? And I think what we have to do is we have to drop the stereotype of the failing school, the failing student. We're all connected in this field. And I think what the system needs to do to change how it handles the situation is become one. Look at each other from the outside, and that you're only as strong as your weakest link. We don't have to keep shutting down our schools. We don't have to keep labeling inappropriately students, because a lot of times in these schools, it's not just because of them. These schools that are, in quotes, people say for bad behavior, it's not really just to keep them in all the time. It's also to keep others who are harming them away from them. And that's why they have to be at this setting to learn how to rejoin the community. And we all deserve a chance. And I think that's the shift that needs to be made, is that everyone deserves a chance, and there should be a unity in this field of education. We're all for the same goal.
And those are good points. And as we talk about students and or where they're being educated are labeled as bad or poor performing, those labels and stigmas carry through with them for the rest of their lives and into adulthood. And so let's talk a little bit about how these labels and barriers affect future employment of these kids and how they move into the world as people with disabilities who have gone through this type of system.
Right. And it's really a domino effect. It's a chain effect where when you have low motivation or you have, let's say the student gives up on going to school because they don't see anything for them, they're now at risk to probably only having, if possible, a minimum wage job, though they may have had the talent to follow the dreams they had and do something that they really love. When we talk about poor performance in schools and the answer being, oh, we'll close down a few schools, such as whether it be the charter school or public schools to meet budget cuts, that decreases the ability of students to gain the support to learn the required skills. Because the whole point of education is we're getting them ready to become productive leaders because they are our future leaders, wherever they come from. But without those skills, they won't be able to gain the employment, which allows them to be the future leaders that they could be. And for example, if they go to a analyst job, they need to know how to write effectively and know how to solve math problems in a sense. Without the proper educational background, they're at a disadvantage of the opportunity to gain employment. And we all have a right to gain a place of work where we feel satisfied and we feel like we're making a difference, and also that we feel safe and we're given that financial security to live our lives. And really it comes down to it's a right to be prepared to work and to gain employment through our learning, because that's how we will gain our secure and safe life, liberty, and property that we are all promised.
I really like that, a right to be prepared. And that's a great way to sum up what we're talking about today. So let's talk about resolution, right? So we have these issues, we have systemic issues that are happening in our education system. How can some of these issues be resolved? Who can provide these solutions? What partners in the community should we be looking at?
Well, it really, since education is a vast system, people tend to think it's the federal government has a lot of oversight over it, but really in the Constitution, it's one of those fields that really falls into states, and that states are relied upon to make the decisions for their constituents. So it starts on the top from the state. I think that the states need to see the schools as a unified factor and really remember that behind your policies are people, their children, their adolescents, and their future employees that need to be prepared. But it's not just the state. It comes down to the counties and the cities, because the states will give the guidelines and the policy and legislation, but it's up to the localities to implement it. I mean, even in our own cities near us, it really becomes an issue of addressing these impoverished communities and giving them the educational initiative and the opportunities. We have so much we can offer. And I think the question needs to be, well, what can we, each of us, do? And that's what leads into my final point on resolution. It's each of us. That as teachers, we, for example, there are great teachers who I've come across, and I myself as a teacher have seen that, we give more time than necessary to each student because they deserve that. And it's not about, are we going to gain anything out of it? Is society going to gain anything out of it? It's, will they gain something out of it, these children and adolescents, because they're going to be our society. And I myself, and I'm sure everyone here agrees, we want to leave a better world and a better life for our future, because that's what we're mandated to do. That's what being a teacher, which not just a teacher being certified or having the certificate, you could be a teacher without that. We all should take on the role of being a teacher for these students and help them get the opportunity to be able to learn, to be prepared. And in the future, maybe we won't have these issues because they'll continue to help solve it. But we have to have a starting point. And I think it has to start, well, what better time than to start now, even in small ways?
That's right. And we will leave it there. And once again, we can all do our part to help these students exercise their right to be prepared. Thank you so much, Seamus. We appreciate having you today.
Thank you.
Empire State of Rights Closed Captioned has been brought to you by Disability Rights New York, your source for disability rights and advocacy. If you enjoyed our program, make sure to subscribe, like, and share this post. If there is a subject you would like us to discuss, please email podcast@drny.org or comment below. Tune in next Wednesday, where we'll bring you more information on disability rights in the state of New York. The closed caption version of this podcast is available on our YouTube channel. To listen to more Empire State of Rights Closed Captioned, follow us on Apple Podcasts and Spotify.